my name is Russell-Pinson. I make educational and entertainment apps, and I live and work out of my home in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I'm basically a one-man shop, so I do the programming, graphics, and sound, and sometimes music for my apps. And today I'm going to just give you a little peek into my world, or my little bubble, such as it is. Now, I don't usually follow the rules or do things the most conventional way, so some of you might find what I have to say refreshing, and some of you might see me as a bad influence. So we'll see. Just to give you a little bit of my background, I started making video games back in 2007, and I made free Flash games that you can play in your browser. And my early titles were an adventure game called Tipping Point, and a couple puzzle games, Block Drop and Collider, and the often misunderstood Furballs. So for some reason, making games and giving them away for free wasn't very profitable for me. So in the summer of 2009, I started porting some of my Flash games to the iPhone. And this was around the time of the iPhone 3G. And the apps got some positive attention, but the sales were pretty disappointing. And I think everybody's been there before. And at this point in time, the economy was kind of taking a nosedive. And I was getting my resume together to go back to work in the real world, probably at a bank. Yeah, so it was kind of it wasn't the best time. But then two lucky events happened. First, an interested buyer approached me to purchase one of my games outright. And the money I made from that sale helped me kind of make ends meet for a few more months. And during that time, I met a guy named Alan Tortolani from a website called ABC Yeah, which some of you might be familiar with. So he contacted me to program some educational apps for him. So the first one we made was called Math Bingo. And it was pretty exciting because as soon as we released it, it went right to #1 in the education charts. So even though it wasn't my app, it was still the closest thing I had to any kind of success on the App Store. So I went on to program 3 more apps for him, including Create a Car and Word Bingo. So you might have seen some of those on the App Store. So I had such a positive experience making educational apps for him that I just decided I would try to make one of my own. So I did. So my first educational app was Stacked with States, and it remains my best-selling app to this day. And I went on to create 4 more educational apps over the next year and a half. So I made Mathmateer, Stack the Countries, Presidents versus Aliens, and Monster Physics. So some of those I've demoed here in previous conferences. So in the last year, some of my apps have had some interesting media appearances, and I just wanted to share this video with you. It's mainly for the other independent developers in the audience, just to show that you can kind of make a splash in the market without just being one person, without having a big budget or a lot of money to spend on advertising.
Okay, so who among us looks at these apps for kids? The hottest app for children right now to learn the U.S. states, all kinds of facts and figures about the United States, is called Stack the States. You click and you drag.
Yeah, the decision app deal, little sliders, can stack the states if you love that app. And I got one.
Another app you like is Stack the Countries.
Yes, okay, so geography is a big issue in this country and around the world, absolutely. So, and it's also good for us parents. So I was doing this with my girls, and my girls were better at geography than I was.
Okay, so that's enough. But it's nice when the kids of famous people like your apps, because you get some free publicity that way. So I could have called my presentation Creating Magic, but I didn't, because when you hear good artists talk about their craft, a lot of times they don't describe themselves as being creators. Sometimes they describe themselves as being more of something like a conduit. So there was this ceramic artist and designer named Eva Ziesel, and she died recently at the age of 105. But when she was asked, how do you create something beautiful? Her response was, you just have to get out of the way. So this is the idea I wanted to explore a little bit. And when I thought about my own experience, I figured it came down to 2 steps. Basically, instead of thinking about creating magic, think about creating an environment where magic can happen. And then be mindful enough to notice when it actually does happen. So I've found that my initial ideas are oftentimes my least creative, and sometimes the more energy I put into thinking about ideas, the harder I try, the less they flow. So what are some ways to break the cycle, and how can we get out of the way? So one way is to step out of your comfort zone and to try something different. And if you were here last year, you might remember Darren Karsten's presentation about going outside his comfort zone and learning how to play the trumpet. So you don't remember that, Darren? Okay. So one thing I started doing a few years ago is called light painting. And if you're not familiar with it, the basic premise is you go out in the middle of the night when it's super dark, and you point a camera at yourself, and you leave the shutter open, and you wave a flashlight around, and you draw by using a flashlight. So this was kind of outside of my comfort zone because I'm really not known for my drawing ability, unlike Darren. And when you're in the complete darkness of night, it's kind of like drawing with a blindfold on. So here's a diagram to help you look at what this setup looks like. It's basically really dark. That's the point. So drawing in complete darkness almost forces you to do something different. When you're drawing, you can't see what you've already drawn, so you can't really be very accurate. But I found that instead of being a limitation, it kind of set me free. And so for the first time, I actually started to like some of the things I was drawing. And in this new environment, I was able to create images that I might not have been able to even imagine otherwise. And for the first time this year, I brought one of my light paintings to life as a character in one of my games. So I call him a light person, and he was inspired by one of my light paintings. So I basically extracted him from the photograph and animated him, and now he appears in my latest adventure game called Tipping Point. And he makes weird noises. So another way you can help get out of the way of the magic is to add randomness to your app. And in my game Block Drop, the block formations are all created in a random fashion. So there's several advantages to that. One is you can create kind of an infinite supply of puzzles. But I found that sometimes the randomly generated ones were better than the ones that I was coming up with. And I should mention that the music in Block Drop is also randomly generated. So as you remove the blocks from the formation, the music gets sparser and there's less and less notes until the very end, where there's only 1 or 2 notes every few seconds. And I'll play a little bit more of that music later. So another way to get out of the way of the magic is to add some life to your apps. And one way to add life is by introducing characters. So a lot of customers mention how they think the states are so lifelike in my game Stack the States, and how they love the interactions and the expressions that they have. But the surprising thing is how simple it is to create this illusion. So I'm just going to give you a quick idea of the logic behind the expressions of the states. So as you can see, they blink every few seconds, and when they're not doing anything else, they just sort of look around in random places. And when a state comes in contact with another object, he instantly moves his eyes to look at it. And for his mouth, when he's falling, you can see his mouth gets open and it gets bigger and bigger as he falls. And otherwise, he just smiles. So that's the basic logic. And it's very simple, but yet it creates sort of a complex experience that people respond to. So it doesn't take very much to bring a character to life. So I knew I was on the right track when I started creating screenshots for the game, and some of the screenshots were rejects because sometimes the states would be blinking, just like in the real world. So another way I add life to my apps is by using a physics engine. And with a physics engine, you basically create your world ahead of time, including the game objects and the environment, and you set different parameters like gravity or friction, and then the physics engine takes over from there. So this creates situations where the game objects and the environment can interact in ways that you might not have thought of ahead of time. Monster physics is another example because the creations that kids make in the game actually do come to life in a way. In this game, kids can design contraptions that I, as the designer, might never have thought of. So with this open design, kids can create their own magic. So sometimes using a physics engine can create situations that you didn't plan for. So for instance, in Stack the States, one thing that wasn't specifically planned or put in the game on purpose was the fact that they can fall off the platform. And kids love this part because it's kind of silly and it's unexpected. And again, I didn't specifically code this into the game, it's just the physics engine doing its thing. I just had to make sure I didn't mess it up by getting rid of it. Mathmateer is another example. So of course kids love building their rockets and blasting them into space, but it always gets a giggle when the rocket returns back to Earth and starts bouncing everywhere like crazy. And so again, I totally did not plan that ahead of time. It's just the physics engine doing what a physics engine does. And all I had to do was sort of get out of the way and notice that it was funny and leave it in the game. So I talked about how to create an environment where magic can happen. So let's take a look at it from the other side and talk about some of the things that can kill the magic. So the most important one to me is just lack of passion. And some of us have already talked about this. So if you're not excited about what you're doing, you really can't expect your customers to be excited. And if you're not passionate about what you do, then you run the risk of falling into what I call the worst case scenario, which is creating something that nobody likes, not even you. So that's bad, right? I know that chart's kind of complicated, but that's what I'm trying to say there. So as long as you're doing what you like, then you'll always be safe from running into that scenario. So another thing that kills the magic is being afraid. So sometimes we can be afraid of the unknown, which forces us to play it safe. But I say, you can't be afraid of what you're doing. You have to be able just to wing it. And you need to feel free to pursue an idea without knowing where it's going to lead. And along the way, it's best not to evaluate and judge it. There'll be plenty of time to do that later. Just allow yourself to follow an idea wherever it leads. And of course, the fear of failure holds us back, keeps us stuck in our comfort zone, and at its worst case, it keeps us from trying, even in the first place. So sometimes we second guess ourselves, but I'm a big believer in having a singular vision as opposed to designing an app by committee. And so I say don't ask your friends for advice. They're very well-meaning, but a lot of times they don't understand the creative process, and they're more likely to steer you towards what's normal and what's safe. And that's not really where magic is born. So don't worry about what other people think. Develop your own singular vision and just do what pleases you. And lastly, I have some bad habits, and I'm guilty of most of these at any given moment. So don't let yourself stare at a blank screen or a blank piece of paper. Go out for a walk, do anything else but that. Don't overthink and don't overplan. You need to give your ideas room to grow and evolve. Don't add too much complication to your project. Keep it as simple as possible. And don't base your decisions on what ought to be. Base it on reality. So don't just say, oh, my app has balloons and animals. Kids love that. You need to make sure that your app actually appeals to kids or whoever your audience is. And lastly, don't just pursue your first idea. So as good as it is, it can always get better. And just to elaborate on that, I just wanted to show you this is kind of the first draft of what would eventually become Stack the States in all of its glory. So in this scenario, the player would be asked a question, and if they got it right, they would be able to add a block to the stack. And I thought it would be fun maybe to have a cannon that you could shoot your stack and knock it down, because kids love to knock down stacks of blocks. So this might have been a fun game, but I'm kind of glad that I pursued it to its final form and didn't just settle for my first idea. So we talked about creating a good environment for creating magic. So the next step is once you've done that, you need to be mindful enough to notice when it actually happens. So one example is a a few years ago, I was walking around a place called Lake Kiowee in South Carolina, and I just noticed this interesting tree kind of caught my eye. It had this knot in it that looked kind of like an animal to me. So I just took a picture of it and went along my way. But as I was creating my adventure game Tipping Point, I used Photoshop to turn it into this. And then this is how it looks like in the final version. So be observant, be mindful. So keep in mind, a lot of magic happens from accidents. So don't be too quick to fix those accidents when they happen. In this scene of Tipping Point, the light person is being released into space, and my intention was to make him just simply fade out as he got further away. But due to a coding error, the opacity setting, instead of stopping at 0, it just went into negative numbers. And it caused the segments of the light person to flash on and off, kind of like a neon sign. And I liked it so much because it looked like it was his special way of saying goodbye. So, I left it in the game. Now, most of what I talked about has been visual in nature, but I wanted to end with sound. As I mentioned earlier, my game Block Drop produces music randomly. So one day while I was testing, I was really blown away by a particular composition that it produced, so I quickly captured it so I wouldn't lose it. I just wanted to share it with you as an example. So in this case, the game produces a random melody and a random bass line. And the melody here that it produced was in 5/4 time and lasted about 7 seconds. It's only 4 notes, but here's what it sounds like. And the game also produced a random bass line in 6/4 time, and it lasts 9 seconds, and it sounds like this. So now, since the two parts have different lengths, when they loop, they get out of sync. And so it takes about 45 seconds for the notes or the parts to get back in sync again. So in essence, it kind of produces a unique 45-second piece of music. So this is what the two parts sound like when played together, and try to listen closely for how the parts get out of sync. So I can listen to this music over and over again and never get tired of hearing it. And I think this piece of music best represents kind of what my presentation is all about, because I didn't create this music per se, I just created the environment by which it was born. And then I was mindful enough to notice when something special happened. So, and now there's this beautiful piece of music in the world that I love and it wouldn't have existed otherwise. So, in conclusion, I'd say don't think about creating magic, think about creating an environment by which magic can happen. And then get out of the way and be mindful enough to notice when it actually does happen. So, thank you.
How do your apps, the content that your apps, as well as your educational approaches, vary so much from one to the next? I'm always curious as to how you decide what app you're going to make. Is it an educational need you saw, or is it a capability you had that you went to a need?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. I don't go after the preschool market because that's very design heavy and the programming requirements are kind of low. So I'm a programmer, so that's why I don't go there. So I try to match, with what I can do. And I'm a one-man shop, so I have to be able to do the whole project. So I'm more just about a good idea. If I get a good idea that I get excited about, that's what I do. So it doesn't have to be all math or all one subject or even a type of game. My latest game isn't even educational, so if I just have a good idea, that's what excites me. Like when I made Stack the States, I wanted to hurry up and finish it so I could play it. I mean, and that's the truth. I really just wanted to play it. So.
I always think of the open part at the beginning is the kind of blue sky where you're just you're being free about it and letting the magic happen, but then you move into a point where you go into production creativity, where one is additive and one's subtractive, and the subtractive part is where you're trying to get from A to B and actually ship a product. And I'd be curious to hear if you stay in the blue sky, it just keeps going on forever, so it doesn't finish. How do you make that defining point where it switches over into, okay, now I'm going to finish this?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing I really don't do, I don't design up front, I don't sketch on paper, so I just start coding. So maybe that helps because in that sense I'm solidifying it as I go. But if you have the right mindset, you can do it in a way that leaves room for good things to happen. And like I said, some of those interesting things that happened because I was coding. Because I was coding while I was dreaming, it created the potential for more interesting things to happen that I could notice and be mindful of. But I don't know how to answer that other than, you do have to be in the clouds, but at some point you have to trap it and put it in a cage and move on.
You mentioned about being a coder and the physics engines that you use. I'm wondering how much of your ideas come out of your knowledge, like choosing a physics engine or a piece of technology, versus just some concept that you want to begin with.
Like how much do the tools play a part?
Exactly.
Well, I don't think it's my choice of tools. I use Xcode and Objective-C like everybody else, and I use the Box 2D physics engine, which is kind of the industry standard. I think just the fact that I use the physics engine helps create a lot of interesting dynamics. Some of that I mentioned here earlier. I don't know if the tools are what makes it, but maybe knowing how to use them, or using them in a way that helps magic happen. All right, well, thank you.